A 7-year-old boy stood in torrential rain outside the iron gates of the city's most feared criminal empire, his small fist clutching a wrinkled photograph while thunder rolled across the pre-dawn sky. Security cameras captured his trembling figure at 5:47 a.m., soaked through his donated jacket, refusing to leave despite the downpour that had turned the cobblestone driveway into rushing streams. Inside the estate's security room, 3 guards watched their monitors with growing unease as the child pressed his face between the bars, his breath creating small clouds of fog against the cold metal. None had ever witnessed such audacity, approaching the fortress where even police commissioners feared to tread without invitation. The boy's lips moved in what appeared to be prayer or rehearsed words, his free hand gripping the gate so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, cascading down his face like tears he refused to shed. 6 blocks away, a woman bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering as she registered the empty mattress beside her where her foster son should have been sleeping. She threw off covers and rushed to his room, finding only neatly folded pajamas on the pillow and the window standing open to the storm. Her scream of his name went unanswered as she grabbed her phone with shaking hands, her mind racing through every horrible possibility. The boy had been with her only 3 weeks, the same amount of time since his father's casket had been lowered into rain-soaked earth. She had promised the social worker she could handle a traumatized child, had sworn she understood the depth of his grief and silence, but she hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for the morning she would wake to find him vanished into the dangerous city streets. The estate's head of security climbed the marble staircase to the 3rd floor, his footsteps echoing through hallways lined with priceless art, acquired through methods that would never survive legal scrutiny. He paused outside the master suite's double doors, knowing his employer despised interruptions during breakfast. But the child at the gates presented a situation without precedent in 15 years of service to the organization. He knocked twice, firm and professional, then entered when the cold voice granted permission. The man inside sat at a mahogany table overlooking manicured gardens, his tailored suit worth more than most families earned in a year, newspapers from 3 countries spread before his untouched meal. His eyes, pale gray like winter ice, lifted from the financial section with the dangerous calm of a predator interrupted during feeding. "This had better justify the disturbance," he said quietly, each word precisely enunciated in a tone that had made grown men confess secrets they'd sworn to graves. His hand remained steady on the crystal coffee cup, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The security chief cleared his throat and explained the situation in clipped sentences. Small boy, approximately 7 years old, drenched and shivering, refusing all attempts at removal from the front gates. The child claimed he needed to speak with the boss personally, would accept no substitutes or intermediaries. "He says it's about his father's funeral," the guard finished, watching his employer's expression carefully for any sign of reaction. "Says his father was Detective Calloway, the cop killed 3 weeks ago during that trafficking bust on the waterfront." The coffee cup paused halfway to lips that had gone momentarily still, and something flickered behind those glacial eyes, a ghost of recognition or perhaps calculation. The room fell into silence broken only by rain hammering against floor-to-ceiling windows. Detective Calloway's name hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun, carrying weight and history that made even this conversation dangerous. The boss set down his cup with deliberate care, the porcelain making no sound against its saucer. "Bring the boy inside," he said finally, his voice carrying an edge his security chief couldn't quite interpret, something between curiosity and an emotion that might have been regret, "and find out who's supposed to be caring for him." The chief security officer hesitated at the door, his hand on the brass handle that had been polished to mirror brightness by staff who knew better than to leave fingerprints on any surface. He'd served Dominic Castellano for 15 years, had witnessed negotiations that ended in handshakes, and others that ended in unmarked graves, but this situation defied every protocol he'd memorized. A child seeking audience with the city's most dangerous criminal represented either elaborate setup or genuine desperation beyond rational calculation. Fisher ran through threat assessment matrices in his mind. Possible surveillance operation, gang initiation gone wrong, trap laid by rivals seeking to exploit any perceived weakness in their organization's armor. But the security footage showed no backup teams lurking in surrounding blocks, no vehicles positioned for ambush or extraction. Just one 7-year-old boy, who had walked 3 miles through darkness and storm to reach gates that grown men approached with trembling hands and rehearsed explanations. The guard stationed at the mansion's entrance had already retrieved emergency blankets from the medical supply closet, his training overriding policy when confronted with a shivering child. He'd offered hot chocolate from the kitchen's industrial-grade machine, but Tommy had refused everything, except permission to wait until someone listened to his request. His foster mother's frantic phone calls to the police had been logged in the department's system 16 minutes ago, her voice breaking as she reported a traumatized child missing from her care. Patrol cars were canvassing the neighborhood where she lived, an area of modest homes where teachers and social workers stretched salaries to cover mortgages on properties that had seen better decades. None of those officers would think to search here, at the Fortress estate, where their own commanders feared to tread without carefully worded warrants and overwhelming backup. The irony struck the security chief as he descended the marble staircase, a cop's son seeking refuge in the last place any law enforcement officer would imagine looking. The guard nodded and retreated, leaving his employer staring at the rain-darkened gardens where roses drooped under the weight of the storm. The man's hand moved to his breast pocket, extracting a worn business card he'd kept for 2 years, a detective's contact information he'd never expected to need. On the back, written in steady handwriting, were words that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights. "Thank you for the truth about my brother. Some debts transcend the law." The signature read simply, Calloway. The boy was escorted through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate, past oil paintings of stern-faced men whose eyes followed his small form with painted judgment. His shoes squeaked against marble floors so polished they reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead like captured stars. 2 guards flanked him without touching, maintaining professional distance as though unsure whether this child represented threat or victim in their carefully ordered world. The boy's gaze remained forward, his jaw set with determination that seemed too old for his young face. They entered a breakfast room flooded with gray morning light, where the most dangerous man in the city stood by windows overlooking gardens that had witnessed transactions worth millions and confessions extracted through methods never documented. He turned as the boy entered, and their eyes met across expensive Persian rugs. The child didn't cower or hesitate. He walked forward with the same resolve that had brought him through rain and darkness to these gates. In his hand, the photograph had survived the storm in a plastic sandwich bag, protected with the care of something infinitely precious. "My name is Tommy Calloway," the boy said, his voice steady despite the shivers racking his small frame. "My father was Detective Andrew Calloway, and he died 23 days ago." The boss studied him with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading human nature like financial reports, noting the borrowed clothes hanging loose on a frame too thin for health, the shadows under eyes that should have sparkled with childhood innocence. This was a child acquainted with loss in ways that created permanent marks. "I know who your father was," the boss replied, gesturing to a chair at the table where his own breakfast sat cooling and forgotten. "Sit down before you collapse." Tommy's legs trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline crash, but he remained standing with the stubborn determination of someone who'd rehearsed this moment through sleepless nights. Water dripped from his clothes onto imported rugs worth more than his foster mother's annual salary, creating dark spots that spread like accusations against the pristine cream fabric. Dominic recognized the particular brand of courage that came from having nothing left to lose. He'd seen it in men facing execution, in women protecting children from predators, in soldiers making last stands against overwhelming odds. This boy carried that same desperate resolve wrapped in a child's fragile frame. The breakfast room's silence stretched between them like a physical thing, broken only by the antique clock on the mantel counting seconds with mechanical precision. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the space, their prisms creating small rainbows that danced on walls lined with artwork, acquired through methods that would never survive legal scrutiny. Staff members hovered just beyond the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene or maintain their trained invisibility in the presence of their employer's private business. The head butler, a man who'd served 3 generations of criminals with discretion that bordered on supernatural, made subtle hand gestures directing others to prepare warm beverages and dry clothes without being asked. Dominic's breakfast companion, a legitimate businessman paying protection money disguised as consulting fees, had excused himself the moment the child entered, recognizing situations that required privacy, even from those who paid handsomely for access. His departure left half-eaten croissants and cooling espresso, as evidence of interrupted negotiations worth 7 figures. The morning's financial newspapers remained spread across the table, their headlines announcing market fluctuations and political scandals that would affect Dominic's portfolio in ways both legal and otherwise. But those concerns felt suddenly distant, rendered trivial by a 7-year-old's presence and the weight of debts that transcended monetary value. Tommy shook his head, maintaining his position 3 feet from the table with the rigid posture of someone delivering a prepared speech. "I need to ask you something first before I accept anything from you." The boss's eyebrow lifted fractionally. Few people refused his hospitality, and none with such quiet dignity wrapped in a child's rain-soaked clothing. "Then ask." "My father's funeral is in 5 days," Tommy said, his voice wavering for the first time as he pulled the photograph from its protective bag. "Nobody's coming except me and Mrs. Patterson, my foster mother." He held up the picture with both hands like an offering or accusation. A detective in dress uniform, pride shining from eyes that shared Tommy's same determined expression. The image showed a man who had believed in something beyond personal survival. "All his cop friends are scared," Tommy continued, each word seeming to cost him something vital. "They said coming to his funeral would make them targets because he died investigating bad people." The boss accepted the photograph, his fingers careful not to smudge the image as he studied the face of a man who had once sat across from him in a different context entirely. Detective Calloway had come to him 2 years ago, not with threats or warrants, but with questions about a brother who had disappeared into the criminal underworld. That night, breaking every code his organization lived by, he had told the detective the truth. His brother had been killed by a rival faction, buried in circumstances that allowed no proper goodbye. Calloway had wept in front of the city's most ruthless crime lord, then thanked him for the closure that official channels never provided. "Your father showed me respect when he had every reason to treat me like the criminal I am," the boss said quietly, handing back the photograph. "He gave my organization peace instead of war when he could have used what I told him to destroy us." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. He stubbornly refused to let fall, his small hands trembling as he clutched his father's image. "He always said everyone deserves dignity, even people who made bad choices. What exactly are you asking me to do?" The boss already knew, but he needed to hear the child say it, needed to understand the full measure of courage it took to stand in this room making impossible demands. "I want you to come to my father's funeral," Tommy whispered, the words rushing out like confession or prayer. "I want people to see that even you thought he deserved respect." The security chief, standing by the door, made a small sound of shock he quickly suppressed, understanding the implications of such a request. For the boss to attend a police detective's funeral would send shockwaves through both legitimate and criminal worlds. Outside, tires screeched on wet pavement as a car door slammed and footsteps raced toward the estate's entrance. A woman's voice carried through the mansion's lower halls, desperate and demanding, insisting the guards let her pass to find her missing child. The boss moved to his desk and pressed an intercom button, instructing his staff to escort Mrs. Patterson to the breakfast room immediately. He returned his attention to Tommy, who stood straighter despite exhaustion threatening to topple him. "Your foster mother sounds terrified," the boss observed, pouring hot chocolate from a silver pot into delicate china. "How long have you been with her?" 3 weeks, Tommy admitted, finally accepting the offered cup with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline crash. "Since the funeral home said they needed someone to claim me." The double doors burst open, and a young woman rushed in, her hair wild from sleep and panic, wearing mismatched clothes grabbed in her frantic search. She froze upon seeing Tommy, relief and fury warring across features that would have been beautiful without the terror etched into every line. "Thank God," she breathed. Then her gaze shifted to the boss, and fear replaced every other emotion. "Please, he's just a child, he doesn't understand." "Mrs. Patterson," the boss interrupted gently, his tone carrying none of the ice that usually frosted his words. "Your son came here to invite me to Detective Calloway's funeral." She stared at him as though he'd spoken a language her mind refused to translate, her protective instinct warring with the absurdity of the statement. Her hand reached for Tommy's shoulder, pulling him against her side with the fierce grip of someone who had already imagined losing him. "Tommy, what were you thinking?" she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "You can't just walk into places like this, you can't—" Her hands shook as she checked Tommy for injuries, her fingers gentle despite the terror that had propelled her through morning traffic and past security checkpoints she'd never imagined breaching. Iris Patterson had been teaching 3rd grade for 5 years, had handled classroom emergencies and parent confrontations with practiced calm, but nothing had prepared her for this. The social services training she'd completed before becoming a foster parent had covered trauma response and attachment disorders, behavioral challenges, and medication management. Not one session had addressed what to do when your traumatized foster child disappeared into the night seeking help from organized crime. She'd thrown on yesterday's jeans and a sweater grabbed from the floor, her hair still tangled from restless sleep, makeup-free face showing every one of her sleepless nights since Tommy had entered her life. Standing in this opulent mansion, wearing clothes that smelled faintly of the cheap detergent she bought in bulk, she'd never felt more out of place. The business card Dominic had given her sat heavy in her jacket pocket, its expensive cardstock and embossed lettering, a physical reminder of the world she'd accidentally entered. She'd memorized the number he'd written, despite knowing she should throw it away, should report this entire situation to the authorities and let them handle whatever dangerous game was unfolding. But the authorities had failed Detective Calloway, had let him die investigating crimes they lacked courage to pursue fully, had abandoned his funeral rather than risk retribution from the same criminal elements they swore to fight. Tommy's faith in official protection had died alongside his father in that waterfront warehouse. Iris understood with sudden clarity that accepting Dominic's help meant crossing lines she'd never imagined approaching, meant compromising principles she'd built a career teaching children to uphold. Yet watching Tommy's small face light with hope for the first time since his father's death, she found her convictions wavering like candles in a storm. "He honored my father once," Tommy interrupted, looking up at her with eyes too ancient for his face. "He's the only person in this whole city who isn't afraid to show respect." The boss watched their interaction with an expression that gave nothing away, though his fingers drummed once against his desk in a pattern his security chief recognized as deep contemplation. Mrs. Patterson's face revealed everything: the exhaustion of sleepless nights caring for a traumatized child, the financial strain of unexpected guardianship, the desperate love of someone trying to be enough when everything felt insufficient. "How did you even know where to find this place?" she asked Tommy, her hand trembling as she smoothed his wet hair from his forehead. Tommy pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his jacket pocket, the paper disintegrating from rain exposure but still legible. It showed a photograph from 2 years ago, this very estate in the background of a story about organized crime's influence on city politics. "Dad kept articles about everything," Tommy explained, his voice small now that his mission was complete, and exhaustion claimed its price. He had a whole box of them in the attic, information about cases he was working. The boss moved closer, extending his hand toward Mrs. Patterson in a gesture of introduction that seemed bizarrely civilized given the circumstances. "We haven't been properly introduced. My name is Dominic Castellano." She stared at the offered hand, as though it might contain a weapon, her jaw tightening with recognition of the name that appeared in newspaper crime sections and whispered conversations about the city's true power structure. Every instinct screamed at her to grab Tommy and run. "Iris Patterson," she managed, her hand briefly touching his in a handshake that felt like signing a contract with the devil himself. "I teach 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary." Something shifted in Dominic's expression at this information, a softening around his eyes that suggested her profession meant something in his private calculus of human worth. He released her hand and returned to his desk, opening a drawer to extract a business card embossed with gold lettering. "The funeral is in 5 days, he said, writing something on the back of the card before handing it to Iris. "I'll be there, and I'll bring associates to ensure no one interferes with the service." Iris took the card with numb fingers, reading the phone number he'd written alongside words that made her heart stutter. "Call this number if anyone threatens you or Tommy before then." The implication hung heavy in the rain-soaked air, that his agreement to attend might bring danger to their doorstep. "Why would anyone interfere?" she asked, though part of her already understood the answer. "It's just a funeral for a police officer. Your foster son's father died investigating a human trafficking operation that cost certain people a great deal of money," Dominic explained, his tone factual and devoid of emotion. "There are individuals who would prefer Detective Calloway's sacrifice not receive public recognition." Tommy's hand found Iris's, squeezing tight, as though anchoring himself against fears he'd carried alone for 23 days. She looked down at him and saw the desperate hope in his eyes, the need for his father's life to mean something beyond a closed case file and empty condolences. "If you come, won't that make you a target too?" Iris asked Dominic, her teacher's instinct to understand motivations overriding her fear. "Why would you risk that for someone you barely knew?" Dominic walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass, as he considered answers he'd spent 2 years avoiding. "Your foster son's father gave me something no one else ever has. He treated me like a human being capable of grief instead of just a criminal deserving punishment." The room fell silent, except for the steady drumming of rain against the mansion's roof, each drop a small percussion marking time between heartbeats. Iris felt the weight of decisions made in desperation, the realization that she'd entered a world where debts were paid in currencies she didn't understand. Detective Calloway came to me seeking information about his missing brother, Dominic continued, still facing the window. He didn't threaten or bargain. He simply asked me, one man to another, if I knew what had happened. His voice carried a quality Iris hadn't expected, something raw beneath the controlled exterior, like bedrock exposed by erosion. She tightened her grip on Tommy, who listened with the intensity of someone learning sacred truths about a father he'd lost too soon. I told him his brother had been killed by people I've since destroyed, Dominic said, turning to face them with eyes that held shadows of violence committed in the name of twisted justice. He thanked me, and then he left me alone for 2 years, never using that conversation against my organization. Tommy took a step forward, pulling free from Iris's protective hold. Did my dad know you were dangerous? Yes, Dominic answered without hesitation, crouching to meet the boy at eye level with a grace that seemed incongruous with his reputation. But he chose to see me as a man who had lost a brother too, rather than just as a threat to be eliminated. The following morning, Dominic's estate transformed into a command center, orchestrating an operation more complex than most corporate mergers. Phones rang across 3 continents as he called in favors owed and debts long forgotten, assembling resources for a funeral that would either cement his legacy or mark the beginning of his downfall. His second in command, a scarred veteran named Fisher, who had survived 3 assassination attempts, stood in the strategy room looking at blueprints of the cemetery, like military intelligence. The elevated positions here and here provide perfect sniper vantage points, he said, tapping the map with a pen that had once been used to sign death warrants. Dominic studied the terrain with the same focus he'd once applied to hostile takeovers of rival territories, understanding that this funeral represented something far more dangerous than business expansion. Word had already spread through the criminal underworld that he planned to honor a fallen detective, and the responses ranged from disbelief to thinly veiled threats. I want our best people positioned at every entrance, Dominic ordered, his finger tracing routes on the blueprint. But they need to be invisible. This is a funeral for a hero, not a demonstration of force. Fisher's eyebrow lifted at the distinction, recognizing something shifting in his employer's priorities that defied decades of established protocol. The Morales family sent a message this morning, he said carefully. They're calling your attendance a betrayal of everything our world stands for. The Morales family profits from selling children to the highest bidder, Dominic replied, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze blood. Detective Calloway died trying to stop them. Their opinion means less than nothing to me. Fisher pulled up surveillance footage on his tablet, showing grainy images of known Morales associates gathering at their primary stronghold across town. Thermal imaging revealed unusual activity for early morning hours, vehicles arriving and departing with the systematic precision of military mobilization rather than typical criminal enterprise operations. Dominic studied the patterns with eyes trained to read violence before it manifested, recognizing the signatures of an organization preparing for confrontation. The Morales family had built their empire on brutality that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable, their reputation earned through public displays of retribution that served as advertising for their ruthlessness. Their human trafficking operation stretched from border towns to major cities, a pipeline of suffering that generated millions monthly through the commodification of desperation. Detective Calloway had been building a case for 18 months before his death, gathering evidence that would have dismantled their entire network if he'd lived to present it. The funeral represented more than honoring one fallen officer. It symbolized defiance against the forces that believed themselves untouchable, that operated in shadows maintained by fear and corruption. Dominic's attendance would shine light into corners that preferred darkness, would encourage others to speak truths they'd been terrorized into silence about. His decision to protect this funeral carried implications that rippled far beyond one ceremony or one child's grief. It represented a choice between the criminal world's code of self-preservation and something resembling actual human decency, a choice he'd spent 20 years avoiding through careful neutrality and strategic ambiguity. The manila folder on his desk contained everything his private investigators had compiled about Detective Calloway's murder: witness statements that contradicted official reports, ballistic evidence suggesting professional execution rather than gang violence, financial records linking the Morales family directly to the warehouse where Calloway had died, evidence that could burn their empire to ash if delivered to the right prosecutors. Across town, Iris Patterson sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, and a phone that kept ringing with numbers she didn't recognize. Tommy colored at the counter, creating a picture of his father in uniform with crayons that had seen better days. She'd called in sick to school for the first time in 5 years, unable to face her classroom, knowing she'd shaken hands with a crime lord and accepted his protection. The business card Dominic had given her sat face up on the table, the gold lettering catching morning light like a small beacon of impossible choices. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Groceries delivered to your door. No strings attached. D." She rushed to the front porch and found 6 bags of food, including Tommy's favorite cereal she could never afford and fresh vegetables she'd given up buying months ago. Tears blurred her vision as she carried the bags inside, hating how relief mixed with shame at accepting help from someone whose wealth was built on suffering. But Tommy needed to eat, and her pride seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. "Is he a bad man?" Tommy asked without looking up from his drawing, his crayon pausing over his father's badge. "The kids at my old school said people like him hurt others." Iris set down the groceries and moved to sit beside him, searching for words that honored truth without destroying the small hope Tommy had found in impossible places. "People are complicated," she said finally. "Sometimes they do bad things and good things, and we have to decide which parts matter most." "Dad always said everyone has a story," Tommy whispered, adding yellow to his father's badge with careful precision. He said understanding the story doesn't excuse the choices, but it helps us remember they're human. The wisdom embedded in Detective Calloway's parenting struck Iris like physical force, understanding why Tommy had walked through rain and darkness to reach Dominic's gates. His father had taught him to see beyond surfaces, to recognize humanity even in the most unlikely places. Her phone rang again, this time showing a number she recognized. The social worker assigned to Tommy's case. She answered with dread pooling in her stomach, already imagining how this conversation would unravel the fragile stability they'd built. "Ms. Patterson, we've had some concerning reports," the social worker began, her voice carrying bureaucratic disapproval. "Someone called claiming you're involving Tommy with dangerous criminal elements." Iris's hand tightened on the phone as fury replaced fear, understanding immediately who had made such a report. The other foster families who had refused to take Tommy, who had looked at his grief and trauma and decided he was too damaged to deserve their care. Tommy asked someone to attend his father's funeral, Iris said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I'm supervising the situation and ensuring his safety." The social worker's skeptical silence spoke volumes about her assessment of Iris's judgment and capabilities. "We need to schedule a home visit before the funeral," she said finally. "I have to verify that Tommy's living environment remains appropriate." Iris agreed to a visit in 2 days and ended the call with hands shaking from suppressed anger and fear of losing the child who had become her entire world in 3 short weeks. Tommy watched her with eyes that understood far too much, his crayon abandoned on the counter. "Are they going to take me away?" he asked, his voice small and resigned as though he'd already accepted this inevitable abandonment. "Everyone always does." She crossed to him and wrapped her arms around his thin shoulders, making a promise she had no idea how to keep. "Not while I'm breathing," she whispered fiercely into his hair. "You're staying right here with me." The morning of the funeral dawned cold and merciless, the sky threatening snow that hadn't fallen in this city for 3 years. Iris dressed Tommy in the only suit she'd been able to afford, purchased from a thrift store, and altered with her mediocre sewing skills to fit his small frame. He stood before the bathroom mirror practicing the speech he'd written for his father, his lips moving silently over words he'd memorized through countless repetitions. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from nightmares that woke him screaming about gunshots and blood spreading across concrete. Iris adjusted his tie with fingers that trembled despite her attempts at composure, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in the mirror behind his small form. The social worker's visit yesterday had gone better than expected, but the woman's suspicious glances at the well-stocked refrigerator suggested she knew something unusual was happening. "You don't have to give the speech if it's too hard," Iris said gently, though she knew he would refuse the escape she offered. "Just being there is enough." Tommy shook his head with the stubborn determination she'd come to recognize as his father's legacy. "He always kept his promises to me," he said, his jaw set with resolve. "I'm keeping mine to him." They arrived at the cemetery an hour early to find it already transformed by preparations that must have cost more than Iris earned in a year. White roses lined the pathway to the burial site, their petals pristine against gray headstones that marked decades of the departed. Men in expensive suits stood at strategic positions throughout the grounds, their earpieces and watchful eyes marking them as Dominic's people despite their attempts at discretion. Iris counted at least 20, though she suspected more remained hidden in the surrounding trees. The funeral director approached with nervous energy, his clipboard clutched like a shield against the unusual circumstances of this service. "Ms. Patterson, we've had some extraordinary offers of assistance with the arrangements," he said, his voice pitched low. Someone anonymously paid for the entire service and upgraded everything. The cemetery's chapel had been transformed overnight with floral arrangements that spoke of wealth applied tastefully rather than ostentatiously. White lilies and roses interspersed with Detective Calloway's favorite flowers, information someone had clearly researched with care. The wooden pews gleamed from fresh polishing, and the stained glass windows had been professionally cleaned to allow maximum light penetration on this gray morning. Iris noticed small details that revealed Dominic's invisible hand. The upgraded sound system ensuring everyone could hear the service clearly, the professional photographer documenting the ceremony so Tommy would have images to treasure, the catering arranged for a reception. She hadn't planned, but now seemed essential. Each element spoke of someone who understood that funerals served the living more than the dead. The guest book positioned at the chapel entrance already contained signatures from people she didn't recognize, names that suggested Dominic had reached out to Detective Calloway's old academy classmates, former partners who had transferred to distant precincts, relatives who lived states away but deserved notification of the service. Someone had taken time to track down connections that official channels had overlooked or deliberately ignored. Tommy stood beside her greeting arrivals with composure that broke her heart, his small hand shaking those of strangers who offered condolences flavored with guilt about their earlier absence. He thanked each person with the politeness his father had instilled, his 7-year-old voice carrying dignity that should have been beyond his years, but had been forced upon him through circumstances no child deserved. A television news crew attempted to set up cameras near the cemetery gates, their presence immediately intercepted by Dominic's security personnel, who explained, with professional courtesy underscored by unmistakable threat, that media coverage was not welcome at this private service. The reporters departed with unusual speed, understanding that some boundaries carried consequences beyond simple trespassing charges. The morning air carried the scent of approaching snow, mixed with the earthiness of recently turned soil from graves being prepared in the section beyond where Detective Calloway would be laid to rest. Iris pulled her coat tighter against wind that seemed determined to penetrate every layer of clothing, her breath visible in small clouds as she watched the gathering crowd with wonder and trepidation. Iris didn't need to ask who. She recognized Dominic's quiet influence in the way the director's hands shook slightly, and his eyes kept darting toward the entrance. That was very generous, she managed, the words feeling inadequate for the complicated gratitude weighing on her chest. Cars began arriving as the appointed hour approached, but instead of the empty service Iris had anticipated, vehicles filled the small parking area and lined the street beyond. She recognized some faces from the police department, younger officers who had apparently found courage in numbers, or perhaps in the protection Dominic's presence implied. Tommy gripped her hand tighter as people filed past offering condolences that seemed genuine despite their earlier abandonment of his father's memory. A woman wearing a detective's badge stopped to kneel before him, her eyes red from crying. "Your father trained me when I first made detective," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He taught me that integrity matters more than promotions, and I'm sorry I let fear stop me from honoring that lesson sooner." Tommy nodded acceptance of her apology with grace that made Iris's throat tighten with pride and heartbreak. He was learning to navigate a world of complicated loyalties and compromised principles before he'd even lost his baby teeth. A black Mercedes pulled through the cemetery gates precisely at the service's scheduled start time, its windows tinted to opacity, and its presence commanding attention from everyone gathered. The vehicle stopped near the gravesite, and Dominic emerged wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Iris's car. He wasn't alone. 50 men and women followed from additional vehicles, all dressed in somber colors and carrying themselves with the deadly grace of people accustomed to violence. They positioned themselves respectfully behind the gathering of civilians, creating a wall of silent protection. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized Dominic from news reports and urban legends, their fear and curiosity evident in sidelong glances and nervous shifting. But no one left. His presence seemed to have granted permission for their attendance, rather than frightening them away. The priest who had agreed to officiate looked between Dominic and the assembled crowd with visible uncertainty about how to begin a service attended by both law enforcement and the city's criminal elite. He cleared his throat and opened his Bible with hands that shook slightly. "We gather today to honor Detective Andrew Calloway," the priest began, his voice gaining strength as he focused on the photograph displayed beside the closed casket. "A man who served this city with unwavering dedication and died protecting the innocent." Dominic stood apart from his people, his position chosen to be visible but not intrusive, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that somehow conveyed profound respect. Iris watched him from across the gathered mourners, trying to reconcile this quiet presence with everything she knew about his reputation. Tommy stepped forward when the priest invited him to speak, climbing onto a small platform with his written speech clutched in both hands. The paper rattled audibly in the cold wind, and for a moment Iris feared he would freeze under the weight of so many watching eyes. Tommy's voice emerged small but steady, carrying across the cemetery with the clarity of absolute conviction. "My dad used to say that being a good person isn't about never making mistakes. It's about choosing to do right, even when doing wrong would be easier." Iris felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her foster son honor his father, with words that carried wisdom beyond his years. Around her, hardened police officers wiped their eyes while Dominic's people stood with expressions carefully blank, yet somehow attentive. "He arrested people, but he never stopped seeing them as people," Tommy continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd before landing on Dominic. "He said everyone has reasons for their choices, and understanding those reasons is the first step toward changing them." A sound erupted from the cemetery's north entrance, motorcycles roaring through the gates with deliberate aggression, their engines drowning Tommy's voice. 7 riders wearing the colors of the Morales family organization circled the gathered mourners like predators evaluating prey. Dominic's people moved instantly, creating a protective barrier between the motorcycles and the civilians, without drawing weapons or making overt threats. Fisher appeared at Dominic's shoulder, his hand inside his jacket where Iris knew a gun must be holstered. "Keep the service going," Dominic said quietly to the priest, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its low volume. "Don't let them steal this moment from the boy." The lead motorcycle cut its engine, and the rider dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a face marked by scars that told stories of violence survived and inflicted. "Castellano," he called out, his accent thick with the cadence of border territories. "You dishonor everything we stand for by mourning this pig." Tommy flinched at the slur against his father, his small hands crumpling the speech he'd worked so hard to prepare. Iris started forward instinctively, but a female member of Dominic's security detail gently blocked her path with an outstretched arm. "This funeral is under my protection," Dominic replied, stepping away from the gathered mourners to face the intruder directly. "You have 30 seconds to leave before I demonstrate exactly how serious I am about that protection." The scarred man laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass, and gestured to his fellow riders who remained mounted and ready. "The Morales family doesn't take orders from traitors who cry over dead cops," he sneered. "We came to deliver a message about loyalty." The tension in the cemetery crystallized into something almost visible, the air itself seeming to thicken with the potential for violence that could erupt from a single wrong word or gesture. Mourners who had come to pay respects found themselves frozen between the instinct to flee and the morbid curiosity that kept them rooted to spots among the headstones. Fisher positioned himself at an angle that gave him clear sightlines to both the motorcycle gang and his employer, his hand resting inside his jacket where custom holsters held weapons he'd hoped not to need today. Behind him, Dominic's other security personnel shifted into formations they'd practiced but never expected to execute at a funeral, their movements economical and professional despite the bizarre circumstances. The priest clutched his Bible with white-knuckled grip, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply shock at witnessing his peaceful cemetery transformed into a potential battlefield. He'd officiated hundreds of funerals over 30 years of ministry, had presided over services for gang members and their victims, but never had he seen criminals openly confront each other over a police officer's grave. Iris felt Tommy pressing against her side, his small body trembling not from cold, but from fear that reminded her of his first nights in her home when every sound sent him diving under covers. She wrapped her arms around him protectively, positioning herself to shield him with her body if the threatened violence materialized into something more than posturing and dangerous words. The younger police officers in attendance reached for weapons they'd worn despite regulations suggesting off-duty officers leave firearms secured at home, their academy training warring with the reality that drawing guns at a funeral would escalate rather than diffuse the situation. Several spoke urgently into phones, calling for backup that might arrive too late to prevent whatever bloodshed seemed increasingly inevitable. The scarred motorcyclist's confidence faltered as he truly registered the number of people surrounding him, not just Dominic's obvious security detail, but also the civilians whose sympathies clearly aligned with the dead detective rather than the criminal organization he represented. His hand moved toward his jacket in a motion that made everyone tense, weapons appearing in the hands of Dominic's people with shocking speed. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made even the brash motorcyclist hesitate. "Your employers sell children into slavery," Dominic said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with devastating clarity. "Detective Calloway died trying to save those children. Your message about loyalty is less than worthless to me." The confrontation had drawn the attention of every person present. The funeral service suspended in a moment of breathless tension. Iris pulled Tommy against her side, shielding him from whatever was about to unfold. "We know where the boy lives," the scarred man said, his threat barely veiled as his gaze found Tommy in the crowd. "We know about his pretty foster mother who teaches at Riverside Elementary." Iris's blood turned to ice at the explicit danger directed toward them, understanding with sudden clarity that accepting Dominic's help had painted targets on their backs. Tommy's hand found hers and squeezed with desperate strength. Dominic moved then, not with the explosive violence Iris had half expected, but with calculated precision that was somehow more terrifying. He crossed the distance between himself and the scarred man in 3 strides, his hand gripping the man's jacket collar with casual strength. "You just threatened a child at his father's funeral," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every listener. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words." The scarred man's bravado crumbled under Dominic's grip, and the sudden presence of 20 armed people materializing from positions throughout the cemetery. His fellow riders started their engines nervously, clearly regretting their dramatic entrance. "The Morales family will hear about this," the man managed, though his voice had lost its earlier swagger. "They won't forget you chose a dead cop over your own kind." Dominic released him with a small push that sent the man stumbling backward toward his motorcycle. "Tell them I said Detective Calloway showed more honor in one day than their entire organization has demonstrated in 20 years, he said clearly. "And tell them that if anyone touches that child or his foster mother, I will personally dismantle their empire piece by piece." The motorcycles retreated with less fanfare than their arrival, their engines fading into the distance like departing thunder. The cemetery fell into shocked silence as mourners processed what they'd witnessed. A crime lord defending a police officer's memory against his own criminal peers. The priest cleared his throat uncertainly, and Dominic nodded toward him before returning to his position at the edge of the gathering. "Please continue," he said to Tommy, whose crumpled speech still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Your father deserves to be honored." Tommy looked at Iris, then at Dominic, and finally at the photograph of his father smiling in dress uniform. He smoothed his ruined speech against his leg, took a shaking breath, and began again from where he'd been interrupted. The service concluded with Tommy's final words, still hanging in the cold air like visible breath, each syllable a testament to love that survived death's separation. Mourners filed past the casket in respectful silence, many touching the polished wood as though transferring their own regrets and admiration through fingertips. Dominic waited until every civilian had paid their respects before approaching, his expensive shoes crunching on gravel that lined the cemetery paths. He stood before Detective Calloway's casket for a long moment, his head bowed in what might have been prayer, or simply acknowledgement of debts that transcended mortality. Iris watched from a distance as he placed a single white rose atop the casket, the gesture so at odds with his reputation that it seemed to belong to a different person entirely. When he turned away, she saw something raw in his expression, before the controlled mask slipped back into place. Tommy broke from Iris's side and ran to Dominic, his small arms wrapping around the crime lord's waist, in a hug that froze every security detail member in shocked attention. Dominic's hands hovered uncertainly, before gently settling on the boy's shoulders, with a tenderness that looked unpracticed, but genuine. "Thank you for keeping your promise," Tommy whispered against the expensive fabric of Dominic's suit. "My dad would have liked that you came." Dominic knelt down, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level with care that suggested he understood the importance of meeting children where they stood. "Your father was a better man than I'll ever be," he said quietly, "but maybe trying to honor his memory will make me slightly less terrible." The honesty in those words struck Iris with unexpected force, revealing cracks in the armor she'd assumed was impenetrable. She approached slowly, aware of Fisher and the other security personnel watching her every movement with predatory assessment. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done," Iris said, her voice catching on emotions too complex to name. "The flowers, the service, protecting us from those men? Don't thank me yet," Dominic interrupted, standing to his full height while keeping one hand on Tommy's shoulder. "The Morales family doesn't make empty threats, and I've just made you both targets by association with me." His bluntness was refreshing after days of people offering empty platitudes about time healing wounds and things happening for reasons. Iris appreciated the respect he showed by treating her as someone capable of handling difficult truths. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, glancing at Tommy, who listened with the solemn attention of a child forced to understand adult dangers. "Do we need to hide? Leave the city?" Dominic shook his head, gesturing to Fisher, who approached carrying a tablet displaying what appeared to be security camera feeds. "I'm having a system installed at your house tonight. Cameras, reinforced locks, panic buttons in every room," he explained. "And you'll have protection detail following you, though you won't always see them." Iris's teacher salary didn't cover rent some months, let alone sophisticated security systems and bodyguards. "I can't afford any of this," she protested, her pride warring with the practical reality of their danger. "I'm barely managing as it is. Consider it payment of a debt to Detective Calloway," Dominic said, his tone brooking no argument. "He gave me something valuable once. I'm returning the favor by protecting what mattered most to him." Tommy tugged at Dominic's sleeve, drawing the crime lord's attention downward. "Can we still visit my dad's grave?" he asked, worry creasing his young forehead. "Or is that too dangerous now?" The question seemed to pain Dominic in ways Iris couldn't fully interpret, shadows crossing his face like clouds obscuring sunlight. "You can visit whenever you want," he promised. "I'll make sure this place stays safe for you." Fisher cleared his throat diplomatically, his gaze scanning the cemetery perimeter with professional vigilance. "Sir, we should move everyone to secure locations," he suggested. "The Morales people could return with reinforcements." Dominic nodded, but didn't immediately move, his attention still focused on Tommy and Iris, with an intensity that felt almost protective. "Fisher will drive you both home," he said. "I have some business to attend to regarding today's interruption." The way he said business sent chills down Iris's spine, understanding that whatever he planned to do would likely involve violence she preferred not to imagine. Yet part of her, the part that had watched him defend a child's right to mourn peacefully, felt a savage satisfaction that someone would answer for the threats made over her son's father's grave. "Will we see you again?" Tommy asked with a child's directness that cut through adult pretense and political maneuvering. "Or was this just for today?" Dominic's expression softened in ways that transformed his features from intimidating to almost approachable. "Would you like to see me again?" he asked, the question seemingly genuine rather than rhetorical. Tommy nodded enthusiastically, his earlier trauma momentarily forgotten in the strange connection he'd formed with this unlikely protector. "You could come for dinner," he suggested, with the innocent assumption that crime lords accepted dinner invitations from struggling foster families. "Ms. Patterson makes really good spaghetti." Iris felt her face flush at the unexpected invitation, simultaneously mortified and touched by Tommy's attempt to build bridges between his fractured worlds. She expected Dominic to politely decline with the kind of gentle excuse adults employed when children asked impossible things. "I haven't had homemade spaghetti in 20 years, Dominic said instead, surprising everyone including his own security team. "What night works for you?" The question hung in the air like something fragile and improbable. A dinner invitation spanning the chasm between law and lawlessness, between poverty and wealth, between the woman trying to save one broken child and the man whose choices had broken countless others. "Friday?" Iris heard herself say, her practical mind screaming about the insanity of inviting a crime lord to her modest home, while her heart recognized something shifting in the man before her. "Around 6? Dominic nodded, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across his features before disappearing behind professional composure. "Friday at 6, he confirmed. "I'll bring wine." The week following the funeral passed in a blur of new routines, shaped by invisible protection and hypervigilance. Iris spotted her security detail on the third day, a woman in a sedan parked across from Riverside Elementary, her casual appearance undermined by the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats. Tommy adapted to the changes with resilience that both impressed and worried Iris, his questions about the cameras and new locks delivered with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had already learned that safety was negotiable, He tested the panic buttons repeatedly until Iris gently explained they were for emergencies only. The social worker called twice, her questions pointed and suspicious about the sudden improvements to their living situation. Iris deflected with partial truths about community support and charitable donations, knowing the full story would result in Tommy's immediate removal from her care. Thursday evening brought an unexpected delivery, a package containing 2 outfits in Tommy's size, expensive brands Iris recognized from window shopping in parts of town she couldn't afford. The note inside read simply, "Every child deserves nice clothes for special occasions. D." She ran her fingers over the soft fabric of a navy sweater that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget, torn between gratitude and resentment at the reminder of how little she could provide on her own. Tommy emerged from his bedroom and gasped at the clothes laid across the sofa. "Are those for me?" he asked, his eyes wide with a delight that made Iris's chest ache. "Can I wear the sweater tomorrow to school?" Iris nodded, unable to deny him this small joy, even as she worried about the questions teachers would ask about her suddenly well-dressed foster son. She helped him try on both outfits, making minor adjustments with pins she'd remove later for proper hemming. Friday arrived with anxiety coiling in Iris's stomach like a living thing, her modest home suddenly feeling inadequate for entertaining someone who lived in a mansion. She cleaned surfaces already spotless and rearranged furniture that had no better configuration. Tommy helped prepare the spaghetti sauce using Detective Calloway's recipe, written in his father's careful handwriting on a stained index card. The boy narrated memories associated with each ingredient, how his dad always added extra garlic, how they'd make meatballs together on Sunday afternoons. The doorbell rang at precisely 6 o'clock. Dominic's punctuality somehow both expected and appreciated. Iris answered to find him standing on her porch holding not just wine, but also a bakery box from the Italian restaurant downtown that had a 6-month waiting list. "I thought dessert might be appropriate," he said, offering the box, which Iris accepted with hands that trembled slightly. "Tiramisu. I hope that's acceptable." He wore casual clothes that probably cost thousands of dollars, yet somehow looked perfectly appropriate for a simple dinner, his presence filling her small entryway, with an energy that had nothing to do with his reputation. Tommy appeared from the kitchen wearing the navy sweater, his face lighting up at seeing their guest. "You came!" Tommy exclaimed, rushing forward with the same uninhibited affection he'd shown at the cemetery. "I helped make the sauce just like my dad taught me." Dominic accepted the boy's enthusiasm with growing ease, his hand ruffling Tommy's hair in a gesture that looked increasingly natural. "Then I'm sure it will be the best spaghetti I've had in years," he said, following them into the small kitchen where sauce simmered on a stove that had seen better decades. Iris watched him take in her home's modest reality, the mismatched furniture acquired from thrift stores, the textbook she graded at a table that wobbled without a folded napkin under one leg, the evidence of a life built on passion for teaching rather than pursuit of wealth. "Your home is lovely," Dominic said, and the sincerity in his voice suggested he meant it. "It feels lived in, cared for." The observation carried weight that made Iris suspect his mansion, for all its luxury, had never felt like a true home. She directed him to wash his hands while she drained pasta, hyper-aware of how domestic this scene appeared. A family dinner that wasn't quite a family and definitely wasn't quite normal. They sat at her small table, knees nearly touching in the cramped space, and Tommy blessed the food with words his father had taught him. Dominic bowed his head respectfully, his hands folded in a posture that suggested familiarity with prayer from a past he no longer inhabited. The meal progressed with surprising ease, Tommy filling silences with chatter about school and his progress in reading, while Iris found herself relaxing despite the surreal nature of serving spaghetti to a crime lord in her kitchen. Dominic asked thoughtful questions and listened with genuine attention. "Ms. Patterson is the best teacher," Tommy announced through a mouthful of pasta he'd forgotten to finish chewing. "She stays after school to help kids who are behind, and she buys supplies with her own money." Iris felt color rising in her cheeks at the praise, uncomfortable with being discussed as though her dedication required recognition. "That's just part of being a good teacher," she deflected. "Students can't learn if they don't have materials." "The school doesn't provide supplies?" Dominic asked, his expression shifting to something that might have been disapproval. "I was under the impression public education received adequate funding." Iris laughed without humor, the sound carrying years of budget cuts and administrative indifference. "Adequate is relative," she explained. "Most teachers spend hundreds from their own paychecks to ensure students have basic necessities." Something calculated crossed Dominic's features, and Iris recognized the look of someone forming plans with resources most people couldn't imagine. "Which school did you say you teach at?" he asked casually, though she suspected the question was anything but casual. "Riverside Elementary," she answered, then quickly added, "Please don't do anything. The system is broken, but throwing money at it won't fix the underlying problems." Dominic's slight smile suggested he'd already decided to involve himself regardless of her protests. "Sometimes broken systems need external pressure to motivate internal change," he said diplomatically. "But we can discuss that another time." Tommy finished his portion and asked to be excused to show Dominic his room, his excitement palpable at having someone take interest in his small world. Dominic followed the boy down the narrow hallway, leaving Iris alone with dishes and the unsettling realization that she'd enjoyed this evening far more than wisdom suggested she should. Weeks transformed into months, with a rhythm that felt both surreal and increasingly natural, Friday dinners becoming a fixture that Tommy anticipated with the joy of a child starved for positive male attention. Dominic arrived promptly each week, his presence gradually shifting from novel to expected. Iris found herself preparing for these evenings with care that had nothing to do with Tommy, and everything to do with the way Dominic's eyes found hers across the dinner table. They spoke in the language of parents discussing a child's progress, but underneath flowed currents of attraction neither acknowledged aloud. The security around their home had become invisible, but unmistakable. No incidents troubled their quiet neighborhood, and the Morales family's threats faded into silence that Iris suspected came at a price she preferred not to examine. Dominic never discussed his business, and she never asked. Tommy's nightmares decreased in frequency, replaced by dreams he described at breakfast about having a real family someday. He drew pictures of 3 stick figures holding hands, and Iris's heart broke at the hope contained in those simple crayon strokes. Dominic brought gifts that spoke of attention to detail, books Tommy mentioned wanting, a new winter coat when he noticed the boys had torn sleeves, art supplies for Iris who had once mentioned missing painting. Each gift was presented casually, as though abundance was simply his default, rather than calculated generosity. The night everything changed arrived in early spring, 6 months after Detective Calloway's funeral. Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, and Iris carried him to bed while Dominic waited in the living room. She returned to find him standing by her bookshelf, examining her collection of worn paperbacks and teaching manuals with genuine interest. "You have eclectic taste," he observed, pulling out a philosophy text she'd kept from college. "Kierkegaard isn't exactly light reading." "I like questions that don't have easy answers," Iris admitted, settling onto the couch with careful distance between where he might sit. "Teaching children means helping them learn to think, not just memorize facts." Dominic replaced the book and turned to face her, his expression carrying an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You're remarkable, you know," he said quietly. "The way you've loved that boy when you owed him nothing. The way you've built a life on principles instead of profit." Iris felt heat rising in her face at the praise that touched something tender beneath her practiced humility. "I'm just doing what anyone decent would do," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Dominic said, moving to sit beside her with deliberate slowness that gave her time to object if she chose. Most people would have returned Tommy to the system rather than accept the danger and difficulty he represents. His proximity made it difficult to think clearly, the scent of his cologne mixing with the familiar comfort of her small home, in ways that felt simultaneously wrong and inevitable. She should ask him to leave, should maintain the professional distance that protected her from complications she couldn't afford. "Why do you keep coming here?" Iris asked instead, the question escaping before wisdom could censor it. "You could have honored your debt to Detective Calloway and walked away, but you keep showing up for Friday dinners." Dominic's hand found hers on the couch cushion between them, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like confession. "Because you and Tommy are the closest thing to genuine goodness I've encountered in 20 years of living in shadows," he admitted. "Being here makes me remember I'm still human." The admission hung in the small living room like something fragile that might shatter if either of them breathed too heavily, the weight of honesty creating intimacy more profound than any physical contact. Iris studied their joined hands, her fingers small and calloused from years of chalk dust and grading papers, his larger and bearing a scar across the knuckles from some violence she'd probably never learn about. She thought about the night they'd met, how terrified she'd been standing in his mansion believing Tommy had walked into mortal danger, and how that fear had slowly transformed into something more complex, over months of Friday dinners, and gradually lowering defenses. The criminal she'd expected to encounter had revealed himself to be a man capable of gentleness, someone who listened to Tommy's rambling stories with genuine interest and remembered small details from conversations weeks prior. Her practical mind cataloged every reason this feeling was dangerous. His past couldn't be erased by present choices. Her career could be jeopardized by association with his reputation. Tommy needed stability rather than the chaos that came from adults acting on attraction they should resist. But her heart had stopped listening to practical objections somewhere around the third Friday, when Dominic had helped Tommy with math homework and celebrated the boy's understanding with enthusiasm that seemed utterly genuine. The house settled around them with the familiar creaks of old construction and inadequate insulation, sounds that had once emphasized her solitude, but now created a cocoon of privacy, where honest conversations could unfold without the performance required in public spaces. Rain had started again outside, droplets tapping against windows like nature providing percussion for this moment of vulnerability. Iris had dated sporadically over the years, other teachers, a firefighter who'd seemed promising until his drinking became apparent, a banker whose idea of commitment was planning dates more than 3 days in advance. None of those relationships had generated the electricity she felt sitting beside Dominic. None had made her feel simultaneously terrified and more alive than she'd been in years. The risk of loving someone with his history felt immense, a precipice she'd sworn never to approach after watching her mother cycle through relationships with men whose charm masked fundamental unreliability. But Dominic wasn't charming in that smooth, practiced way. He was direct and honest about his flaws, acknowledged his past without making excuses, and seemed genuinely committed to becoming someone worthy of the trust Tommy had placed in him. Iris knew she should withdraw her hand, should reinforce boundaries that had already blurred beyond recognition. Instead, she squeezed his fingers gently, acknowledging the truth they'd both been avoiding for months. "I'm falling in love with you," Dominic said, the words delivered with the same directness he applied to everything else. "I know I have no right to feel this way. I know my life is darkness and you deserve light, but I can't keep pretending this is just about protecting Tommy anymore." The confession hung between them like something fragile and precious, demanding response Iris wasn't sure she could give. Her practical mind cataloged all the reasons this was impossible: his criminal life, her teaching career, the example they'd set for Tommy. But her heart remembered 6 months of Friday dinners where he'd been gentle and thoughtful, where he'd listened to Tommy's stories with genuine interest, where he'd looked at her like she was the most important person in any room despite the modest reality of her existence. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff with no certainty of landing safely. "And it terrifies me because I don't know how this could possibly work." Dominic lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-fashioned courtliness that seemed innate, rather than performed. "I've been meeting with federal prosecutors," he said quietly, offering information in exchange for immunity, preparing to leave my organization entirely. Iris stared at him, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "You'd give up everything?" she asked, understanding that such betrayal of his former life carried risks most people couldn't survive. "Everything I'd be giving up is built on suffering I can't continue to ignore," Dominic replied, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Tommy looks at me like I'm someone worth admiring. I want to actually become that person instead of just pretending for a few hours each week." The sound of small feet padding down the hallway interrupted their moment, and they separated just as Tommy appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I had a bad dream," he mumbled, moving instinctively toward Iris, but stopping when he saw Dominic still present. Both adults opened their arms simultaneously, and Tommy's face transformed with joy as he realized he could have both. He climbed between them on the couch, and they bracketed him with protective warmth. "What if you stayed?" Tommy asked Dominic with a child's directness, his voice muffled against the crime lord's shoulder. "Not just for dinner, but for always. Like a real family?" Iris met Dominic's eyes over Tommy's head, seeing her own hope and fear reflected in his gray gaze. "Would you want that?" Dominic asked the boy gently. "For me to be part of your family permanently?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically, his small hands gripping both their sleeves like anchors. "Ms. Patterson could be my real mom, and you could be my real dad, and we could all be together." Dominic looked to Iris, the question clear in his expression, even unspoken. She thought of every practical reason to refuse, every way this could shatter their fragile stability. But she also thought of 6 months of Friday dinners, of the man who had defended a child's right to mourn, of the way he looked at her like she was precious. "Yes," she said simply, the word containing multitudes of hope and fear and desperate faith. "I want that too." 3 months later, Dominic's testimony brought down the Morales trafficking operation and resulted in immunity for his cooperation with authorities. He signed over his criminal assets to funds benefiting victims of organized crime, keeping only legitimate business holdings he'd maintained as cover. The day his legal transformation finalized, he appeared at Iris's door, not with wine, but with a ring, modest by his former standards, but perfect for the life they were building together. She said yes while Tommy cheered, and immediately began planning a ceremony where he could be ring-bearer. They married quietly in the same church where Detective Calloway's funeral had been held, with Tommy standing between them as they exchanged vows about choosing light over darkness and building family from love rather than blood. The boy held both their hands, his smile brighter than any sun. Dominic established an education foundation in Detective Calloway's name, funding supplies for underprivileged schools and scholarships for children who had lost parents to violence. Iris continued teaching, her classroom now equipped with everything she'd once bought with her own salary. Tommy thrived with the stability of parents who chose him deliberately, his nightmares fading as security replaced uncertainty. He visited his father's grave every month with both Iris and Dominic, telling stories about the family he'd built from impossible circumstances and unexpected grace. The first year of their marriage brought challenges neither had anticipated, Dominic adjusting to legitimate business practices that required patience instead of intimidation. Iris navigating the social complexities of being married to someone whose past remained whispered about in courtrooms and newspapers. They built their life together with deliberate intention, each compromise a brick and foundation strong enough to support their unconventional family. Tommy's adoption finalized 6 months after the wedding, the judge approving the petition with unusual speed after reviewing character references from federal prosecutors and victim advocacy groups. The boy who had started life abandoned by his birth mother and orphaned by violence now possessed a family forged through choice rather than obligation. Dominic discovered unexpected satisfaction in attending parent-teacher conferences and school plays, his presence initially causing nervous reactions from other parents until his consistent, appropriate behavior established new patterns of acceptance. He learned to coach Tommy's soccer team despite never having played the sport, his strategic mind adapting to games where violence wasn't an acceptable tactic. Iris watched her husband transform through small moments, teaching Tommy to ride a bike with patience that seemed learned rather than innate, reading bedtime stories with voices for each character, attending every award ceremony even when business obligations beckoned. The man who had ruled through fear became someone who ruled the household through gentle guidance and terrible dad jokes. Their home filled with photographs documenting ordinary moments that felt extraordinary given their origins. Birthday parties, holiday dinners, weekend trips to museums where Dominic's encyclopedic art knowledge came from acquisitions he'd once made through theft rather than purchase. Each image captured evidence of redemption's possibility for those brave enough to pursue it. The Detective Calloway Memorial Scholarship Fund had provided college education for 37 students by their second anniversary, each recipient someone who had lost a parent to violence and demonstrated academic promise despite traumatic circumstances. Tommy helped select winners each year, his father's legacy expanding through young lives given opportunities that tragedy might have stolen. The photograph of Detective Calloway in uniform sat on their mantel beside their wedding picture, honoring the man whose death had somehow brought 3 broken people together into something whole. Tommy sometimes caught Dominic standing before both images, and understood that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose it. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing these stories to you.